Good afternoon. Please take a seat. We're ready to start. So welcome to everyone. I'm Carolyn Wu. I'm actually a 3-time Boilermaker, 75, 76, 79. You know, for all of you who go to Mackey Arena, the Purdue parlance for such a person is a three-peat. So anyway, so I need 3 chances. But today is my great privilege to introduce 3 people for a very important conversation, and it's on feeding the future. Today happens to be World Food Day. It's a day where we really focus our attention on the issue of food security, and particularly thinking ahead, you know, in the next 30 years, and I look at the audience, I think you're going to all be around in the next 30 years. We have at least 1 billion more people to feed, and people will also be consuming more, and also will be dealing with the consequences of climate change. So it's quite a big challenge ahead, which is worth our thinking and paying attention to. I'm glad to say that there are many people working on this particular challenge, and particularly at Purdue University. I know President Daniels is going to say it too, but one of our Purdue PhD alum, Dr. Akin Adesina, is actually receiving the World Food Prize, which is like the Nobel Prize of Agriculture today. And so really, and not only that, this is actually the 3rd Purdue alum who have received this prize in the last 10 years. We've had 3 people with Purdue PhD. 2 of them are actually Purdue faculty who have received this prize, which demonstrates the commitment of this university to agriculture. So I just want to say it's a great day, World Food Day, to convene this conversation on how to feed the world. My privilege is that I've had a chance to work with all 3 individuals in different capacities. And they're people I just respect deeply. They are very inspiring to me. I'm allowed a total of 4 minutes to do my introduction, so I have to make it quick. So why are they so inspiring to me? Because of their values. They're all people who have a passion for making the world better in different ways. And not only are they passionate about their mission, they also have the capability and the leadership to make it happen. They have a sense of urgency about the various issues that they have the privilege to work on. So they're extremely inspiring to me. You could look up their bio and longer description on the web, but for each one of them, I just want to give a little highlight of the person. So one who does not need a lot of introduction from me is your president, Mitch Daniels. He's had a great career, but really his time at Purdue University, more than any other president in American higher education, is totally committed to make education affordable. And also at the same time to have excellent academics. To do this, he has taken a lot of different actions. He has frozen tuition for the last 5 years. He has introduced various innovations, such as the income sharing agreements with students, where universities actually have some skin in the game related to student successes. And he has put resources behind faculty hires as well as research. And I just want to say, for his commitment to both affordability and now inclusiveness and excellence, Purdue University has been recognized now 2 years in a row in the life of the Wall Street Journal ranking, which is only 2 years old. Purdue has been ranked as one of the top 5 public universities. And all this achieved while holding tuition constant. And not only that, Purdue is the only university which has a top 10 agriculture school and an engineering school. One thing I don't know whether you're aware of or not, and that is Purdue holds a top ranking, along with 2 other universities, Michigan and William and Mary, in terms of having the best student-faculty ratio. at about 12-1, which is a lot of times the private school ratio. So here is a man who's deeply committed to both affordability and quality and achieving both at the same time, taking actions which are innovative. My second guest is actually a friend, a colleague, and that is Sean Callahan. And Sean is the CEO and president of Catholic Relief Services. Sean is known as a relational person and therefore a relational leader. He's a person who cares deeply about the well-being of other people, whether they are our beneficiaries, whether they're colleagues, or whether they are partners. He is sincerely interested in them. He spent 30 years in the field of international development. CRS serves in over 100 countries and about 120 million people. Sean has worked with Mother Teresa and Dalai Lama directly in his career. And one thing about CRS, very similar to Purdue University, is that being good stewards of the resources they received is very important. So CRS has a policy of overhead costs not exceeding 10%, and in 2016, that number was only 6%. Of every dollar received, 94 cents go into the field and goes into programming. Sean has overseen many different disasters going through 3 decades, and has led and been a major person driving innovations within CRS. One thing you might not know is that CRS is now one of 4 finalists in a competition sponsored by the MacArthur Foundation. It's called 100 and Change. And the reason for that title is that the winner of that competition will win $100 million. There were merely 1,900 entries. And CRS is selected now as one of the 4 finalists for the problem it proposes to solve, and that problem is about how we deal with children who are in orphanages. There are 8 million of these children, and 80 to 90% of them actually has a living parent. And orphanages are not the best environment for students to grow. Our third guest is actually Chris Policinski, and Chris is the CEO of Land of Lakes. Chris, since he served as CEO at Land of Lakes, had doubled the revenue of Land of Lakes. Today, if you compare it to a Fortune 500 company, it would be about at the midpoint of the Fortune 500 companies. Most of us know Land of Lakes as our beloved butter. Land of Lakes is actually farmer-owned co-op, even though it has the success of a Fortune 500 company. Land of Lakes is actually now much more than a butter company. First of all, it operates all over the United States, but also in 50 countries. And it has transformed itself from a butter company into what is now considered a precision agriculture and technology company. And today, through various divestitures and acquisitions, it has refocused its mission to work on 3 things: food, feed, and seed. Actually, it's food, seed, and feed. Right? So the integrated chain between these 3 to bring the leading technology into this area so that it could step up to the challenge of how to feed more people with less resources. So today, these are your 3 panelists. Chris Plain was running late, and I don't know after I came out. Oh, she's here. All right, so let's bring out our panelists. Please give them a Boilermaker welcome.
You did give them time together. Perfect. Thank you, Carolyn. Good to see you. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'll just let me start by briefly thanking Carolyn. Unless it's astronauts, there is no heritage more associated with our university than agriculture and now the leadership, we believe, in addressing, people talk about grand challenges. The grandest of all is going to be feeding 9 billion people. And we believe that Boilermakers, as they have been for a long time, will be at the forefront of that. And there's no better personification of that tradition than Carolyn. I hope you know, without my reciting it, about her spectacular record of humanitarianism and leadership, scientific, business, and otherwise. And there are countless people alive and thriving today, literally because of her life and work. And Carolyn, we're really, really proud of you. So to my left, Sean Callahan, who you just heard about. His left, Chris Policinski, who made it on time. I think he was planning, I think the business about plane trouble was a fabrication. I think he was just planning a spectacular entrance, and it's been spoiled. But we're really, really grateful to have these two leaders here. I'll ask just a few questions to get things going, and then in a little while we'll invite you to step up and lead the balance of the hour's discussion. Let me start, and I guess I'll start with Sean. These days, any article one reads, any conference one attends on the subject of the difficulties of feeding a growing world and a world that's expecting more in the way of protein and other new nutritional enhancements, sometimes seems to start and stop with Africa. Are we overlooking anything, or should we really be focusing on that continent when we address this topic?
You know, I think we need to focus on Africa. Absolutely no question. As many people know, by the time 2050, there will be 1 billion more people in Africa. So it's almost doubling its current size. So definitely a focus on Africa, and there's tremendous needs, whether they're infrastructural needs or training and capacity and other levels. But I don't think we can forget other areas of the world. When you look at India, high level of stunting currently, and India and China probably have more small farmers than any other place in the world. Similarly, Central America, we have Guatemala and other countries which have enough food but don't have the appropriate nutrition to prevent stunting in their children. And so, although Africa probably should be the focus and a priority, we shouldn't forget other areas of the world.
Chris, you're in dozens of countries. Are there others you would add to the list at those that Sean just
Well, I think
mentioned?
Sean's answer is a pretty good one. Africa clearly is a focal point. I think we have to focus overall on improving nutrition as well in lots of different places, particularly where we see great news in emerging middle class and protein in the diets. I'd also add right here at home. We have a lot of folks who go hungry at night, and or go to bed hungry at night. And you know, in a rich country like the U.S., I find that unacceptable. So I think we need to both look at those places and improving nutrition, not just getting food to them, but the nutritious food, and then right here at home as well.
So if someone gave you the lamp and the wishes, or the wand, and one maybe action you could take, one technological breakthrough, what is the biggest constraint, Chris, that you see, and what would be what should we hope most earnestly for in terms of big leaps forward in addressing this problem?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm going to give you an answer that's not driven by the technology itself, and no place other than Purdue that knows this better. We have some amazing technology that can drive productivity in lots of different environments in lots of different ways. What we need to work on, and the single biggest thing that I would wish for if I had a magic wand, is that we change consumer attitudes around the role of science and technology in producing food, particularly what I'll call arrogance from rich countries that somehow think science and technology doesn't have a role in food, or turned around in everything but food. We have an amazing story, again, driven by some of the things developed right here at Purdue, of driving more output with less input to feed hungry folks. But there's an interesting thing in the US and developed Europe that's occurring, and that is there's almost an anti-science mindset as it relates to food production, and we have to change that because it's hurting everybody, but it's hurting the most food insecure places the worst.
Sean, what's your take on that?
I would agree. I would just add access to what Chris said, and access to quality and high nutrition foods, because it's not that people don't have access to food, it's they don't have access to quality and good nutritional foods. And so we can have a problem like we have in the United States with obesity or highly processed food, but we still aren't helping those young children have the opportunity to grow and to thrive.
I was going to save this question for later, but since Chris brought it up very eloquently, let me just ask you now. I mean, can we feed 9 billion people if, at least in many parts of the world, we deny ourselves access to the technologies that would produce more with fewer inputs? And then as part of that question, is it moral to do that when it might condemn millions to hunger or worse?
Well, I'll start out. I think it's absolutely immoral to deny the developing world the access to the technology, safe, proven technology, that could allow their local ag economies to mature and thrive and feed their local populations. So I think that's the right word to use, and I think we have to be pleasantly assertive about using it. It is not a moral choice to deny those folks access to food, abundant, nutritious food. And I do believe feeding the soon-to-be 9, 10 billion folks is going to require us figuring out how to grow more with less. We might be able to do it, but if you think about the consequences on the environment of just driving productivity by expanding our footprint or reducing food waste, not sure you could do it because there's not much more arable land to be brought into production, maybe 6%, half of what's available, and we have to nearly double food production. But even if we could, the impact on the environment doesn't make sense. So I think we have to really come back around and talk about the morality of denying those folks that choice or that opportunity.
Yeah, I would just say that I think the moral question really is those of us who get 3 meals a day, do we make a decision that someone else shouldn't have that same opportunity? And so I don't think we can make that.
No, there is an arrogant, pull-up-the-ladder character to some of this, and worse than ironic.
It is.
Yeah. Life's so often about trade-offs, and there are a couple, in fact, Sean, something you've already mentioned gives rise to one of these. I wanted to ask about one or two of those. First, talk about the future as between large-scale agriculture and preserving or strengthening small-scale agriculture, which is still so prevalent in most of the places that you're working. How's that going to look 10 or 20 years from now? Will we still have both, or will one have to yield to the small have to yield to the larger scale in the quest for greater productivity?
I would say, at least in the short term, we're going to have both, and we're going to have to blend. And it would be wonderful if we could work with Purdue to figure out what that blend should be. But if you look at in many of the countries in which we work, 75–80% of the population are employed in agriculture. We're now going to have another 2 billion people in the world. Pull them out of agriculture, where 80% of these populations are. Where do they go? What do they do? And so I think both from a sense of the strengthening the farm, keeping the family on the farm, and providing assistance, we can do little bits of investment that help people increase their productivity and increase their yields. I just came back from South Sudan, where met with some people who are planting groundnut in an area, and they're doing it as a community. And we gave them a little investment, and they told me, next year when you come back, we'll double it. And the year after that, we'll double it again. So it's not that they need handouts, they need an investment, and that's what the small farmers need. Certain big agriculture will be there, but the small farmers continue to need our support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Sean's answer is right. We need both. We had a farmer from South Africa, a 60,000-acre farmer from South Africa come visit us recently around some crop inputs and some technology that was appropriate for his farms, yet we work with some very small holder farmers in other countries in Africa. We're going to need both. A little bit of small versus large is in the eye of the beholder. I think a natural progression of the benefits of scale can be that smallholder farmer buying some land next door and buying the adjacent property, allowing those families to do something else. That's a progression we've seen over time in this country and others. I would expect that progression in some of the food insecure parts of the world over time. Mm-hmm. Are we going to see the kinds of farms that I described at the outset? No. But I think we'll see the benefits of scale at that level take some effect.
If I might add one other point, I think it's something else that's crucial that we found in our work is aggregating the small farmers. So it's not that you have one small farmer and a large farmer, but you might have 100,000 small cacao growers or soy or millet growers. Bring them together, buying, selling cooperatives and other ways to help access the markets for these groups of small farmers instead of placing them against large farmers.
Because, correct me if you see it differently, but whereas the overriding goal is enough food that actually makes it to someone's table to end hunger and the worst poverty, but there are social consequences to the kind of changes that might be necessary, or that if that was your only goal. And it sounds like you think that you can keep a balance, get some benefits of scale without upending societies which are still so agrarian.
I think if we were to move to the large scale, we'd have even a more rapid migration from the rural to urban, and the urban centers just don't have the infrastructure to support those. So I think we would make that difficult social decision much more of a crisis situation.
And I agree with Sean. It's a scale in the eye of the beholder. So let me tell you about a smallholder farmer, a woman in Malawi who I visited now about 2 years ago. She started in Rwanda. I'm sorry. She started farming after she lost her husband and her family, and she was given a cow by a USAID program. And she was trained. It was a program we happened to implement by Land O'Lakes. And guess what? She got another cow. She named that cow Land O'Lakes. But over the years, she's quite a businesswoman. She's probably one of the best business people I've ever met. She figured out how to buy the adjacent property, how to train other neighbors, and develop a scale that was right for that community. And she's spectacular. In fact, a fun story about her, I said, "Why are you doing this?" She's training on her own or her neighbors to do just what you described, participate in a community, to go to a milk collection station. And the great thing is she didn't even understand my question. She looked at me and said, "Why wouldn't I?" That's really cool.
We've also found that, on Chris's comment of women getting into agriculture more and more, if we provided the same resources, same capacity building, and same training to women, the reports are that we could increase agricultural production by 12 to 17%. So one of the key issues is let's not forget the resources that we already have out there, and let's strengthen those resources and give them the opportunity to grow.
Is there a trade-off between, in the countries you work in, between processed foods, which have some problems attached to them that we have the luxury maybe to worry about, and addressing the hunger problems that remain? And if so, how should we think about that?
Well, my 2 cents, clearly we've got some challenges here with the percentage of our population that's obese. We've got some calories in, calories out challenges. We do provide some very nutritionally dense food in the form of processed foods. We've got to manage that here, and education around calories in, calories out, I think, is central to achieving success there. Packaged foods, in quotes, as they apply to current food insecure parts of the world, could be a big advantage in terms of providing inventoriable places for output to go that can be stored. And that's one of the challenges is, post-harvest loss or loss up and down the supply chain between what's made and what gets to consumers. Is it in a form that can be inventoried? So I think, like anything, it cuts both ways, but I think there are some opportunities as we add more fully finished foods to developing countries.
I would just add that I think it's a false dichotomy. When I started out with CRS, I was working in Nicaragua, and I went out to a farm, and it was a beautiful farm. A woman had it, and fruit on the trees, and you got it, and it was just succulent grapefruits, and she was growing corn. She had a terrific farm, but she couldn't sell it because there wasn't the infrastructure to get it there, couldn't get it to the capital, and she said, "Yeah, it's beautiful, but it's all going to rot." And instead, processed food and goods that was better packaged could be shipped from Costa Rica to Managua, and that's what everyone was buying. So I think the key issue to processed foods is, can we ensure that those processed foods aren't quote-unquote junk food, but they're food that can help people, they have a longer lifespan, and that it would be the type of food that will help an increasingly urban population in many of the countries we serve.
Yeah. We're approaching the halfway point, so please ready your questions. After one more, we'll let the audience take over. I'd like to finish this part with just a general question about which there's a fair amount of literature and and there's been a fair amount of debate in recent years. And I'd ask it this way: can or has traditional foreign aid, foreign assistance, in the end be counterproductive to indigenous agriculture or to development of the institutions that would create self-government and so forth in countries you've worked in?
You know, to jump in first, I think I often hear this question and people bring it up. And first of all, the foreign aid that we have has continually evolved. And we've learned a lot of things and it's moved forward. And I would say traditional foreign aid done wrong is probably bad and probably was always bad. But if you did it as it was intended to be done, if you did the right analysis, for instance, providing food commodities place, there's a Bellman analysis that you have to do to make sure you're not going to stifle local production. Mm-hmm. So done well, it can continue to assist the local populations and at the same time show the generosity of the American people. And so people are seeing this caring and the values that we have as a country in assisting them. So again, to me, it's more, is it foreign aid that was done right? And is it foreign aid that is learning from past assistance that we provided that may not have been successful? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think Sean's right. I think some of the old monetization programs that truly disrupted the development of a local marketplace were a problem. I think as we're mindful of that, they do have a role in terms of emergency aid or priming the pump. But the transfer of our technology to build food systems is vital to, I think, accelerating progress from some desperate food insecurity situations to a better place. So Sean's answer would be, we are evolving, we're learning, and I think that's the most important thing.
So I'm going to cheat and ask one more, which your answers just brought to mind. A good friend of mine, a virtually lifelong friend, Jim Morris, a great Hoosier, led the World Food Program. You both know him very, very well for 8 years, I guess, at least. And no one is more passionate about this subject, unless it's you two, than Jim Morris. He probably spent more time in North Korea than any American over the last couple of decades. And it leads me to ask this question. We have supplied untold amounts of food, absent which there would have been horrible famines, many deaths in North Korea. But it has enabled the continuation of a regime which now threatens the world with nuclear weapons. How's a good Catholic think about that moral question?
You know, I think you've got a competition of our values in many of these cases, but you know, as a people, I can't help but think, and as I see overseas, the assistance that we provided, if I were to ask people in the room, how many people knew that there was a famine in Ethiopia last year, and people would look around, I didn't hear about it. Well, that's because the assistance that the U.S. government provided prevented a famine from occurring. We didn't have to see those pictures of children starving. I don't think any of us could live with ourselves if we saw pictures of North Koreans starving. We're too generous of people, and we couldn't stand for that. The fact that their governments sometimes aren't doing what's best for their own people or best for the world community, we have to handle that in a diplomatic way, but we shouldn't make the children the pawns of these leaders.
Just to build on that in a more general sense, we very clearly see through our modest impact in global development this linkage of food security leading to economic stability, leading to political stability. And that gate swings the other way if you don't get it right. So I really do think this notion of providing support and accelerated development for food in secure parts of the world isn't, at its core, it's a moral value. But if you wanted to ladder up to or ladder over to another topic, it's a matter of national security. And where do you do that? To Sean's point, everywhere.
Yeah. Your turn. Who would like to, and I think we can hear you from your seats.
There are some microphones.
But there are microphones if you want to march forward. Yeah.
It's certainly necessary that food be produced that provides the calorie needs of the 9 billion people. If we get to the point where we can reach the calorie needs but not necessarily the full nutritional needs, are nutritional supplements, are vitamins, things like that, is that part of the equation, or are we really, is the full goal, the only goal, all your nutrition and calories from food?
Well, I will tell you, there's not a project that we're involved in that I don't think has a nutritional component. So it's not just more food, it's more nutritious food and education around what that means for families, particularly young children where there's dramatic stunting issues. I think fortification of food, which is vitamins, is a part of the answer to that, particularly in some of the most dire circumstances. If you look at the stunting issue, that's one we have to get after right away, and I think fortifying foods to get there makes sense.
I would agree with that. I think fortification's there. Certainly other methods of educating people. So, for calories in much of Africa, you use cassava. Well, can we move from, white cassava to more orange flesh so they have a heightened level of that? But with 160 million children stunted in the world, none of those children will reach their full potential. We can't accept that. If it were our children, we would give them the vitamins, right? And so we need to do that as a people.
I'm very interested in the focus on stunting, because stunting is a very complex phenomenon. And having studied in a number of populations, we're talking about food, but we really can't talk about food alone. You alluded to the fact that we really have to address substitution of foods, particularly for weaning age children, which is when the infections occur that then lead to the stunting, right? So if you were to plan a better world for food, how would you envelop the issue of weaning foods and having societies that can address multiple substitutions of foods when one food product maybe goes down and another one might be available? How would you culturally transmit that when in many cultures there are actual food prohibitions during some diseases like respiratory disease?
Sure. Great question. And stunting, is a key issue, and it makes all of my staff very nervous when I talk about it, because they're all afraid that we're going to, have to do something. But, I would say as we look at it, the most important thing that we find in development, the most important thing is trust. And that trust is the way that you get people to have behavior change. So when we go into communities, we learn from the local people. We have those local leaders, whether they're traditional birth attendants or whether it's an illiterate woman in the village who has the trust of the community, because it is behavior change. Now, many of us sometimes we're abhorrent on trying to change local culture. But if local culture isn't doing good for the family, isn't doing good for the child, then it needs to be changed. I mean, there's violence against women that's occurring that some people say is local culture. I'm sorry, it's not local culture. That's an aberration of local culture. And so we need to look at it between, as you had suggested, the first 1,000 days from pregnancy on. It's treating the mother in a way that she should be respected. It's elevating the status of woman, and it's also educating them. So when we talk about healthy children and healthy people, it's not just about agriculture. It's preventing diseases, and it's about education for that community. It's really an integral approach that we try to do, and it starts with that trust in the community so that they can accept that what you're trying to do is assist them, not denigrate their culture or take over their land. What we're trying to do is assist that local population.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what I can add to that, in the sense that when you asked the question, I thought, other than sheer terror, that I don't know how to answer that question. It pointed out the fact that the roles around accelerating progress from some tremendously food insecure parts of the world to a better place requires us to work together in different ways. We're a Fortune 200 company that knows a lot about how to grow stuff, create markets, and work with farmers to show them how to grow things, not just use the technology or the technology that's available at their level. That's interesting, but it is far from sufficient. What we need is the perspective you bring and the perspective Sean brings to be able to affect change in a way that makes sense.
If I might just add, the fact that we're sitting here is no accident. We need the innovation, the technology, the thinking power of the university, and we need business that helps us get it to market. How do you apply it? How do you make it more efficient and get it out there? And then as a non-governmental organization, We have that connection and access to these isolated communities, and so together we need to do it. There isn't one element of this chain that can be broken and still address the needs of these people.
I think this is a big deal. So sometimes when I go to forums like this, I hear almost a threatened tone from some of the traditional NGOs or folks that have been associated with global development for decades and do brilliant work as companies come into this space. And it shouldn't be threatening at all. It is just what Sean described. We have to figure out how to fulfill our roles in a way that maximizes our potential. And that requires us to work together, I think, in a better and different way all the time.
We're tilting towards talking about social systems, which is fantastic. Many of the solutions that the panel talked about in the discussion seem to be tilted a bit towards production and producing more food. So I wonder if you could speak to whether or not just producing more food is the issue. You alluded to waste, which suggests that just producing more food is not always the issue, especially in a country like the US. And if we're not looking at increasing overall production, what are the roles of public, private, NGO sectors in solving these last mile questions, whether it's social systems, whether it is infrastructure, whether it is producing more food that people want to eat instead of ground nuts and maize and soybeans and these other things that go into unfood or non-food products, at least not things that people directly eat.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take a crack at it. I think you answered the question. It is a broad-scale social change, right? So we need to improve the rule of law in many of these countries. That has very little to do with actually planting a seed and getting a crop. We have to work on educational systems and developing cultures that are more inclusive, that we can bring the full potential of all those folks out, and we can start to change some of the dynamics that get in the way of food production. And we have to get after food production, and not just growing the food, but linking it to a marketplace and creating an economic system that's sustainable. So it is broad-scale social change. And one of the challenges for us is this notion of partnerships then. So Sean knows a little bit about this, but if you were at Land O'Lakes right now, you would be part of conversations in our global development group that go something like this. We're not good at everything, and we should stop pretending to be so. What are we absolutely best in the world at? Let's focus our skill sets on that, be more broadly known for that, whatever it is, and I have an idea, which may or may not be right. And then let's figure out how to partner better, because it is broad-scale social change that will create true sustainable progress.
I was going to be more succinct than Chris and just answer your question by saying yes. But maybe a little story as well. I was in a village in India, and when we came up, we came in a white Land Rover Jeep, and so people, came around the car, and the community had progressed. And what I mean by had progressed is when we first went to that village, the women were still inside their houses, and they heard the conversation from inside. And after several years now, when we arrived to the village, the women were sitting down and the men were providing seats and assistance for the women and gathering around the outside. So to one degree, there was some social change that occurred there. But this woman who was a traditional birth attendant came up and said, "You people are so intelligent, you can have a lot to offer to us." And she kept, talking to us as if we were something very, very special. And so after she gave us the accolades and we talked for a little while, I said, how many children have you delivered in this community? And she said, "Oh, in the last 8 months, about 80 in these 5 different villages." And I said, "Do you know how many children I've delivered?" I said, "Who's the expert here? We might be able to give you a little bit of assistance, but you're the one that changes your community. You're the one that lives there day in and day out." And so I think it is a mentality. I think we as a country can show how we're helping our people within the United States. We can make sure that our systems work better, and we can show what good governance means to people. They admire that. They want that type of good governance and things. And so I think we, by living our lives a little better and demanding integrity from our systems, really have tremendous influence that we can assist others.
Hi, thank you very much for all coming and speaking today. My question is, as a senior who's graduating in May in sustainable food and farming systems, the job market is kind of looming large, and I'm interested in international development. So I was wondering what organizations you see as people that are in positions to see this well, that are making real impact in their communities and not just sort of plopping something down and then leaving in an international community, that current students that are rising seniors, that are undergraduates with an undergraduate's degree can get involved in and actually make a real impact. Thank you.
Maybe just to start off, we had a little conversation with some of the leadership of Purdue on why Catholic Relief Services and Purdue have a relationship. And it wasn't based on convenience, it was based on values. Who we are as an agency and who Purdue is as a university. And so I would say when you look at opportunities for employment, when you look at where you want to go down the line, look at the values of that organization and agency, and does that reflect your values? Because that's the only way you're going to be successful there. And I think we have found that the values of Purdue to use its tremendous resources to assist those less fortunate mirrored our values. And so there are many agencies out there, and you could do a lot of different things. And it's not that we used to think in the nonprofit world that we wore the white hats and that these business guys wore the black hats. They were the bad guys and we were the good guys. That's no longer the case. We're all trying to link to markets. We're all trying to bring to the next level. But it's really about the values of the company or the values of the organization to link with the values that you've learned here at Purdue.
Here's where I'll be more direct than Sean. I think CRS and LOL are two pretty good choices.
Let me just offer one quick thought, and it takes us back to something Carolyn said. Every organization, every NGO you look at is going to have a very lofty value statement. Yeah. But you want to look behind that because there's a huge spectrum in terms of effectiveness and, frankly, I think how well they live out those values. And one metric, what percentage of their budget is spent on administration or on something other than meeting the needs of their target population. And when you see a low single digit like CRS, you know that's an organization that's working every day to live out its values and to devote every possible penny of resources to the mission. So that's when you get down to the strokes and you want to start separating best from less than best, there's one way.
Thanks for this great discussion. You said some really important things about everyone having access to nutritious foods and the risks of both under and overnutrition. Now, if you go in any direction from West Lafayette, you'll see a lot of corn and soy that's being harvested, and it's primarily going into either animal feed or processing in some sort of way. So my question is, are there anything we should be thinking about in terms of agricultural policy that would help towards some of these goals that you've been talking about?
Yeah, I'll take a crack at it. I think where we need to turn our attention is to educating and informing consumers so that they can make good choices. Consumers here in a wealthy country like the US or developed Europe about what those choices mean and elsewhere, because I do believe an informed and educated consumer makes good choices about their food. Building a little bit on an earlier conversation we had here, I am very disappointed with some of the choices that consumers in the US make and are led to make around food. Absence claims, I think, are inherently dangerous. Whether or not you want to consume food that's produced in a certain way should be an individual choice. And right now in the US, we have absence claims as a primary form of marketing. Said another way, a lot of branded firms will use an absence claim to imply a health benefit to consumers, to charge a premium, and market their goods. And if you think about it, it's absence of what? A safe, proven technology, some of which, many of which, were developed right here at consumers. To do what? To imply a health benefit. That, in a rich country, you can say, isn't that big a deal? Well, I think it's a really big deal to the degree it relates to getting more investment in technology or even current technologies to parts of the world that would benefit from them. So I do think we need to step up our game to educate consumers in rich countries and in developing countries around food and nutrition, factually. That's the best thing I think we can do, and then let consumers make those choices.
I might just add that I think the policy context is crucial as well. I know on campus earlier you had Senator Young speaking to you and all, and he's been a great proponent of the Farm Bill and other efforts on food security internationally. But get involved in these policy decisions that are happening in your local community, because oftentimes they extend and reach around the world.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentations and for being here. I would like to ask about the contention between small agricultural and large industrial agriculture. I come from the Andes of South America, in which we pride ourselves for being the home of the potatoes. And we, now we say we have about over 1,000 varieties of potatoes. And it seems to me that in the region, industrialization and technology have stopped and reduced the possibilities of development in the region. And I'm not an expert in agriculture. I am a historian. And I say this because there has been documented more than 4,000 varieties of potatoes. Now we only talk about 1,000 because that's all we got, and there's less and less. In the last 100 years, the variety of alpacas, for instance, have also been reduced because the market's preference for white wool, and most of the local producers have destined the color, the beautiful colors, the variety of color alpacas to be slaughtered, and the white was preserved because the high prices in the market. Right now, quinoa is the most looked for product around the world, and has been produced ever at this maximum capacity, and also in other areas where it's not local and but the quality is not the same. However, we have documented about 65 varieties of quinoa produced in the Andean region. And because the high demand of the international market, there is a push to leave behind the majority of this variety and come down to one or two varieties that are more productive, that are more, perhaps profitable. I don't have the technical words for that.
Let's try to get to a, can we get to a question mark?
Yes, thank you. Well, what I'd like to ask is, how do you see your organization and institution intervene in that process of not just focusing in the industrial production, but also the variety that is fundamental of these products? Thank you.
Well, there's a lot in your question. I think I'll go back to a couple comments and try and get to it. But first, we need both. We need large farms to produce lots of food in abundance at low price to feed hungry folks. We need small farms to be able to serve niche markets or be the incubators of the next great idea. And in the U.S., that means one thing. And I don't, we talk about large versus small, and I think that's not necessarily the right argument. If there's a small grain farmer here near Lafayette, and they're a family-owned grain farm, and they decide to send their children to Purdue, and they decide to become doctors and lawyers and move to the city, but their neighbor buys that farm, they can be characterized as a consolidator or as a large farm. But their children came to Purdue and went to the ag school and came back to the farm. Still a family farm, much larger, applying capital, not just hard labor, across more. And they produce more output at lower cost and are a productive force. I think we need small farms in a market like this to be incubators of the next great idea. And in this rich country, that means something different than I think it is in the markets that you're describing. I talked earlier about creating sustainable economic systems, and if you want to support a sustainable economic system and have an export market, the consumer does have a voice, and if that consumer is different, you have a trade-off to make in that local market. Do I want to participate in that and bring money back to my local market to create a sustainable economic system? And then what are the role of differentiated farms in that marketplace to serve local consumers? So I think it's a big question, but I think we have to look at it not as good or bad or one or the other, but both.
I might just add that I'm glad on the way your question went, because at first I thought it was an attack on my ethnicity. You know, with a name like Sean Callahan, we used to think that we invented the potato, you know, in Ireland. But when I went to Latin America and found out that, you know, Peru and many of the Andean cultures had it, I was, you know, pleasantly surprised, and we learned a lot. You know, as we work with local farmers, we provide them access to market. We want to link them to markets, but we don't tell them how to grow, you know, what to grow. We try to tell them this will increase, you know, your yields and assistance. And I think quinoa is a good example of a super grain that now the world is looking at. Now, maybe the production, you know, should have been moderated a little bit, or you know, given a little bit of lead time on how you can better do that, so you don't inflate the cost in the local sector, so that people don't have access to it locally, you know, but that we can do it in different ways. But the idea is not to convert people away from something that they're doing, but give them the choices and the opportunities so that small farmer can choose for themselves, and we're not mandating how they produce.
Me? So I'll make a brief comment on an earlier question, and then I'll ask my question. The point was about nutrition, and is nutrition involved in the efforts? You know, you can have calories, but have nutritious foods. And Sean and Chris, you both used the term fortification, but yet we're talking about sustainable efforts. We're talking about great population growth. Last year, the recipient of the World Food Prize was a good friend of mine, Howdy Bowie, and he got it for biofortification. And Harvest Plus, that program, is a finalist for the MacArthur Award of $100 million. So what I would love to hear out of Sean and Chris's voice sometimes is the word biofortification, because you're using biology and nature to make the nutrients, not having to synthesize them and transport them. So I just hope you can mention that in the future. And related to that, some of the technologies are not GMO, but we need to invest more to get them out there, and the technologies sit here. Okay, so that's my comment. And we actually are starting efforts at Purdue to do biofortification for the USA and the developing world, in iron, zinc, and certain carotenoids. But now my question is, I go to these meetings and they say, we're going to have 9 billion people by 2050. Well, we got to feed them. Well, why are we assuming there will be 9 billion people? Why can't we work on trying to prevent there from being 9 billion people? And how can we do that? And then two, once we get to 9 billion in 2050, then what's the next one? 18 billion in 2075? So we just assume there's 9 billion. What can we do about that?
Well, I don't know if I have an answer to your question, but I think a guy named Malthus talked about not being able to feed the population a long time ago, and we've been able to figure it out over time. So I think that, you know, that's been our focus, is how to improve ag productivity to feed a hungry planet, both today and in the near future. You know, I think that that's the right focus, because if we'd have tried to answer that question in the days of Malthus, we might have gotten to a very different answer than where we are today.
I think it's a really interesting question, and we shouldn't assume there'll be 9 billion people. We know that education and the empowerment of women can lead to very dramatic and swift changes in fertility rates. And much of the world, which was just, you know, a couple decades ago, was wringing its hands about overpopulation everywhere, is now the issue is going to be the aging of populations which aren't replacing themselves. And we've seen, even in the developing world, some really rapid plummets, but not everywhere, not yet in Africa, and but even in some Islamic countries. And so I do think that there is that economic growth does produce educational changes, which leads to social changes that sometimes surprise the demographers. And I think it's entirely possible, if we have sustained economic growth internationally, that you could see some flattening of that curve. And I agree, that's the quickest way to make ends meet.
And the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I think, is right on point with what you were saying there.
Yeah.
And I'll just add biofortification. That's very good.
Yeah. Grand standard. We've got time for one, maybe two more. So let's go start back there.
So we're talking about feeding the world, but I think a big part of the equation is environmental health overall. So Chris, coming from a dairy-driven company, what is your opinion on how animal agriculture impacts the environment overall? That includes deforestation and greenhouse gas emission contributions in biodiversity.
Yeah, I think the answer is to grow more with less across the spectrum. And, you know, we look at the business, and I did arrive during Carolyn's introduction of me, and we talked about the growth of Land O'Lakes. In a very exciting way, our fastest growing business unit has been our crop inputs unit that uses big data and different technologies to help farmers manage their crops in season to grow a lot more with less. We've launched an entire sustainability division off of that. And that, I think, is part of our future. I think we have to figure out how to grow more with less. And in fact, we should be very confident. If you look back to our grandparents' generation, my grandparents' generation, maybe your great-grandparents' generation, you know, we're growing more than 2.5 times more output with flat inputs. So the value of all dairy, crops, livestock as output against all the input, land, labor, capital, feed, seed, more than 2.5 times with flat. That's a tremendous output story to feed hungry folks. It's also a tremendous sustainability story. If you look at some of our most productive crops, we're growing 6.5 times more corn right now on 13% fewer acres in the United States because of modern practices. So I think adding modern business practices, the role of big data, analytics, in-season management is definitely how we can grow more with less. And it's not just an output story, it's a sustainability story.
If I could just jump in, although you didn't ask the question to me, but you usually at these events you should mention your boss. And the Holy Father, Pope Francis, just gave a presentation at the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome. And the two things that he focused on feeding the world and on World Food Day, one was the environment, because we need to be good stewards of our environment all around the world, and that's key. The second element that he raised was migration. We need to provide people with peaceful locations so that they can continue to invest. Much of the damage that we've had to food productivity in much of East Africa this past year has been due to violence, that people can't farm in different areas. And even our own staff in South Sudan, most 80% of their families have emigrated from the country because there isn't a peaceful location. You can imagine the damage that as well, these war and this violence creates on our environment. So it's not only misusing it, but it's also denigrating it in other ways.
If anybody here has the temerity to follow the Pope,
Pretty good.
We'll take one more question.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I have a comment to that gentleman's question. So even if we're not going to have 9 billion people in 2050, I think people are growing. Well, you see, in China, we have more and more mid-class population. So I like eating steak, and I want to have a steak every day. So even if not for that more population, I think we just need more quality, good food. And I have a question. My question is that I think water is considered food as well. So, you know, 70% of the water goes to agriculture, and I think a lot of people in Africa, they still don't have sanitary water to drink every day. So how do you balance that? For even domestic water is not a large percentage for water usage every day. So how do you maintain the water for people and to use it in agriculture?
Yeah. You know, when we do agriculture, it's not doing agriculture without consideration of an integral approach in how we work. And so we map out the whole watershed of the area so that you know how that water is going to be used, how it's collected, and other ways. But I think beyond those type of approaches, I think it's crucial for us to think, how do we use water in this country? And I was in an African country, and someone was saying, And someone came up to me and said, "Is it true?" And I said, "Is what true?" And they said, "Do you go to the bathroom in clean drinking water?" And it never struck me that we, use clean drinking water in ways that no other, many other countries in the world would not. And so I think we have to really reflect upon our own stewardship of water as a resource.
That's a great picture. You know what I meant. I forgot what I was going to say. No, I want to come back to 6.5 times more output on 13% fewer acres. It's not just the acres, it's everything. It's everything. Think about land use, water use, input use. 6.5 times more output, 13% fewer acres. Now link that to my earlier comments about technology and making sure safe, proven technologies are allowed to thrive across the world. I think it is a big deal that in this country and developed Europe, that we're very careful not to view food through the eyes of a rich country and wealthy consumers that spend a small fraction of their income on food. Small fraction. It's easy in that environment to say, let me treat food as fashion. As a marketer, let me deploy an absence claim to imply a health benefit to a consumer that's not all that engaged, that impugns the technology. So I think we want to get after feeding the soon-to-be 9 billion. I think we have to have an honest conversation about the role of a rich country in setting the table for the appropriate technologies to be used in the developing world. Because right now we've got it wrong. And I'm disappointed personally that the dialogue we have in food in this country is so superficial. We have to engage consumers in our developed world, in rich countries, to really understand the consequences of the choices they're making, or the fact that they haven't spent enough time to become truly engaged on their own, to make good judgments about absence claims. And I am talking about GMO-free, not exclusively, but others like that. What's the role of GMO-free on technology companies that have spent a lot of money to develop that technology? What's the role in terms of chilling future investments in the next great technology that will allow us to grow more resilient crops, that will allow us to adapt to climate variability, that will allow us to grow crops in very arid parts of the world with minimal water? What's that impact? I can't calculate it, but I can tell you it's dire. We have to have a much more robust dialogue in rich countries about where our food comes from. And we have to engage our whole brain in it, not just the emotional side.
In addition to the contributions to technology, which you each very generously mentioned, Purdue does try to contribute to that conversation. I'm happy to let everybody know I've just learned that early next year you can obtain a newly published book, How to Feed the World. Every chapter is written by a different Purdue faculty or staff member, edited by Jessica Ice and Ken Foster, and I recommend it to you. It's just the latest indication of our university-wide commitment to this grandest of challenges. I want to thank everybody for coming, and in thanking, Chris and Sean, I know you're thanking their two great organizations for what they're doing for the world.